Lonely Cowboy thought his dog was gone, but it returned leading a lost Apache widow. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The sun had already passed its strongest point when Mason Calder stepped out of his lonely cabin and narrowed his eyes toward the fields stretching across the land near Horseshoe Bend. The afternoon was dry and windswept, the air thick with dust drifting in thin layers that scraped against his throat. Mason tightened his coat around his ribs as he scanned the open ground, feeling the first drop of unease settle into his stomach. Bristle had not returned for hours, and that wasn't normal for a trained cattle dog who understood the boundaries of the property better than most men understood their own homes. Mason was 39, a former cavalry scout who had turned to ranching after grief hollowed out every part of his old life. He had lived alone for nearly 6 years, buried in routine and silence that kept his mind steady. His wife, Lorna, and their unborn child had been killed during a raid while he was miles away tending work he believed couldn't wait. That single decision had shaped the rest of his days, pushing him into solitude he hadn't escaped since. The land here suited him, quiet, wide, empty, leaving no room for pitying eyes or questions he didn't want to answer. His only true companion was Bristle, the mottled gray dog who had stayed beside him on every long night and through every difficult winter. Now, the dog's absence gnawed at him. He stepped down from the porch, boots sinking into the dry earth, and followed a narrow footpath between the fence posts leading toward the distant tree line. The wind picked up enough to push dust against the side of his face, and he raised a hand instinctively, blinking against the sting. He paused near the fence and listened, hoping to catch a familiar bark, but the open land returned nothing except the low creak of dry branches. Mason inhaled slowly. "Come on, boy," he muttered under his breath, though he already knew Bristle wasn't close. He swung his leg over the fence and headed toward the woods. His pace was controlled but edged with tension, each step shifting from habit into alertness. His hand rested near the revolver at his hip, not because he expected trouble, but because the woods hid things a man couldn't see until they were too close. He felt the old scout instincts waking in his chest, the careful angles of his shoulders, the way he placed his feet, the way he slowed his breathing to listen for the faintest sound. A sharp bark carried through the trees. It was distant, strained. Mason's pulse jumped. His body moved before his mind fully processed it. Boots crunching leaves, branches scraping his coat as he pushed deeper into the forest. The shadows grew longer here, the light fading between the overhead limbs. The sound came again, bristle, but off rhythm, like the dog was calling for help, not announcing prey. Mason didn't stop to think about the possibilities. He stepped over a fallen log, pushed past a tight cluster of young pines, and entered a narrow rocky clearing he recognized from months ago when searching for a stray calf. His breath caught. Bristle stood stiff, tail lowered, ears pinned, hovering close to a collapsed figure. A woman. Mason slowed his approach, his heartbeat heavy in his ears. She lay half-curled against the stones, her limbs slack from exhaustion, her breathing shallow enough he could barely see her chest move. Her long dark hair was tangled with dirt and small beads, the strands sticking to her sweat-matted skin. Her deerskin dress had been torn open along one side from a hard fall, exposing the line of her chest and the tight contour of her upper body, the damage revealing how violently she must have fought whatever had driven her this far. Her skin carried scrapes down both arms, a deep bruise around one shoulder, and dried blood crusted around a wound she had tried to bind alone with a strip of cloth. She looked young, no older than 26, but worn down by something far larger than time. Mason felt his stomach drop at the sight, a sharp mix of alarm, concern, and a heavy recognition of someone who had been running from danger with no help. He approached slowly, lowering himself to one knee without touching her yet. Bristle moved aside, ears flicking back in a silent plea for Mason to act quickly. "Ma'am," Mason said quietly, his voice rough from disuse. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, revealing dark eyes clouded by pain and fatigue. She startled when she saw him. A small shift of her fingers against the ground, a sharp inhale from her cracked lips, but she didn't have the strength to pull away. Her throat moved once, then, barely above a whisper, "Help!" The word pushed a tight breath out of Mason's lungs. He steadied himself, evaluating the injuries with the trained eye of someone who had tended wounded soldiers in worse conditions. She was dehydrated, bruised, and on the verge of collapse from exhaustion. Whatever or whoever she had escaped would not be far behind if they were tracking her. Mason slid his arms under her carefully, supporting her weight with one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back. She flinched when he lifted her, her ribs tensed under his hand, her breath caught, her fingers curled instinctively in the torn fabric of her dress. Mason adjusted immediately, shifting his grip so he wouldn't press against any injuries. "You're all right," he said quietly. "I've got you." Her head fell against his shoulder as her strength gave way, her breath brushing against his collarbone in uneven bursts. Bristle stayed close, tail brushing Mason's leg as the three began the long walk back toward the cabin. The journey through the woods was slow. Mason stepped carefully to avoid jostling her, watching the ground more than the path ahead. Every crack of a twig made him glance sideways, checking the shadows for movement. His mind raced, not with panic, but with calculation. How far had she come? How long had she been running? Why had she ended up near his land? And most unsettling of all, how close had danger followed? By the time he broke through the tree-line, the sun had dipped low enough to paint the land in dim amber. His arms ached from carrying her weight, but he didn't stop. Her breathing grew softer and shorter, each inhale an effort. He reached the cabin, kicked the door open with controlled force, and carried her inside. The cabin was small, one room, a stove, a table, and narrow bed tucked in the corner, but it held heat and supplies enough to keep someone alive. Mason lowered her onto the floor beside the stove, where the warmth radiated strongest, and pulled his coat off to place beneath her head so she wouldn't touch the cold boards directly. Bristles settled beside her immediately, resting his muzzle near her arm. Mason grabbed a basin, filled it with water, and lit a lamp so he could see clearly. He knelt again, inspecting her injuries one by one. Her ribs were bruised, her shoulders swollen, her palms torn from gripping rocks or branches as she tried to stay upright on her journey. She opened her eyes briefly, looking at him with a mix of fear and confused relief. Mason felt something pull in his chest, empathy, sharp and sudden. He knew the look of someone who had been pushed past every limit. "You're safe here," he said, voice low and steady. "I'll take care of the rest." Her eyes closed again, this time from exhaustion rather than fear. Mason stayed beside her, watching the slow rise of her chest, knowing he had taken responsibility for someone whose past he didn't yet understand, but whose survival now rested entirely in his hands. He didn't move away. He couldn't. The cabin filled with the steady warmth of the stove as evening settled in, the orange glow spreading across the floorboards and pushing back the cold that crept in through the walls. Mason placed the lamp closer to the injured Apache woman, adjusting its angle so the light wouldn't sting her eyes. She lay still, barely breathing, her skin pale beneath the dirt, her chest rising in short, strained motions. Bristle curled beside her hip, ears twitching at every tiny shift she made, his loyalty anchoring the tense atmosphere inside the room. Mason took a deep breath as he pulled a folded towel from a drawer and dipped it into the basin filled with warm water. His hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility settling hard against his ribs. He had not cared for another person in years. The last time he had tried, everything he loved had been ripped out of his life. Now, the presence of this woman forced memories to scrape at him from places he thought he had locked away. He steadied himself, kneeling beside her. Her long hair fanned across the coat he'd placed under her head, beads and thin leather strips tangled among the strands. Dirt clung to her cheek, and a faint tremor ran through her jaw. Mason touched the towel to her skin with slow, controlled pressure, lifting away dust and dried sweat without disturbing the wound on her shoulder. Her eyes fluttered open. The reaction was small, but sharp enough to tense the air between them. "You're hurt," he said quietly, keeping his voice low so she wouldn't startle. She blinked with effort. Her breathing clicked faintly in her throat as she tried to speak, but her voice failed her. Mason leaned back slightly to give her space, letting her gather what little strength she had. "Where am I?" The words scraped out in barely audible fragments. "My place," he answered. "Near Horseshoe Bend. You collapsed in the woods. My dog found you." Her gaze drifted to Bristle. The dog lifted his head, just enough to acknowledge her. She watched him for a moment, recognizing the silent concern in the dog's posture, then returned her focus to Mason. "You carried me," she murmured, not as accusation, but as facts she needed to understand. "You couldn't walk," he said. "Didn't leave me a choice." She breathed out slowly, the movement shallow but deliberate. The tension in her fingers eased slightly, though her shoulders remained tight with caution. Mason reached for a small cloth pouch on the table. Inside were herbs he kept for emergencies, things he remembered from years of treating wounded riders and injured cavalry scouts. He crushed a small amount in the palm of his hand, mixed it with warm water, and dipped a clean strip of cloth inside. "This will help with the swelling," he said, holding the cloth where she could see it before bringing it to her shoulder. She didn't flinch when he applied it, though the pain made her jaw tighten. He observed the way her breath hitched, the slight quiver in her fingers, the stubborn strength in her expression as she refused to show how much it hurt. "What's your name?" Mason asked, needing something to anchor this moment, something that made the situation feel human instead of desperate. "Sonny," she whispered. Mason nodded once. Mason called her. Her eyes studied him in a brief, searching way, taking in his worn coat, the uneven gray at his temples, the scar along his jaw from a past fight he never talked about. She looked at him as though trying to determine whether he was someone she should fear or trust. Her throat moved with difficulty. "Why help me?" The question settled heavier than he expected. Mason sat back on his heels, exhaling in a slow, tired breath he'd been carrying since the moment he found her. "I've seen enough people die alone," he answered. "Didn't want that happening here." Sonny absorbed his words without reacting outwardly. Her eyes drifted back to the ceiling. Though her body remained tight, her instincts still alert despite her exhaustion. Mason stood and crossed to the corner near the bed, pulling out a second blanket. He placed it near her feet, careful not to cover her without permission. He'd learned long ago that injured people, especially those who had been fleeing danger, could panic if touched unexpectedly. "You can use it if the cold gets worse," he said. Sonny nodded faintly. "Thank you." He stepped back to the table, grabbing his knife and wiping the blade clean purely out of habit. The familiar task steadied his thoughts, helping him regain control of the storm inside his mind. He didn't look at her again until he heard her shift, the sound small but enough to pull his attention. "Water," she said quietly. Mason moved immediately. He filled the tin cup with warm water and held it for her, offering support only when she struggled to lift her arm. She drank in slow, painful swallows, her throat working to accept the small relief. When she handed the cup back, her hand shook from exhaustion. "You've been without food for a while," he said. "I'll warm something when you can keep water down." She closed her eyes again, sinking deeper into the blanket. Her breathing remained tight, but steadier than before. The stove crackled, spreading heat across the wood planks beneath her. Mason took a seat at the table, angled just enough so he could see both her and the door. Bristle lay stretched out beside her, keeping watch in his own silent way. Sonny's voice broke the quiet. "Men chasing." Mason straightened. "How many?" "3," she whispered. "Maybe 4. I ran. Lost them yesterday. Might still be looking." Mason's expression hardened, his jaw shifting as old instincts resurfaced. He wasn't afraid for himself. He hadn't feared another man in years. But the idea of strangers moving through his woods at night, armed, desperate, unpredictable, triggered something protective he wasn't ready to admit. "They won't reach this cabin," he said. "Not tonight." She didn't respond, but the slight drop of her shoulders told him she believed him more than she expected to. The fire crackled louder, filling the quiet space. Mason watched her for a long moment, not out of curiosity, but out of a promise forming in the back of his mind. She had walked into his life in the most unexpected way, and he wasn't the kind of man who turned away once he took responsibility for someone's survival. Whether he wanted it or not, their lives had already tied together, and the night outside grew colder. Snow began falling shortly after dusk, thin flakes drifting down in slow, uneven patterns as the temperature dropped. The wind tapped lightly against the cabin walls, pushing through tiny gaps in the wood, carrying a cold that spread across the floorboards in a creeping way. Inside, the stove glowed brighter than before, the firewood stacked beside it crackling with steady warmth. Mason kept it burning high on purpose. He didn't want the cold to settle near Sonny's injuries, not with her breathing already strained. Sonny lay wrapped in the blanket he had given her, one arm pressed carefully against her ribs while she tried to shift into a more comfortable position. She moved slowly, every adjustment calculated to avoid sharp pain. Mason noticed the way her eyes tightened whenever she inhaled too deeply, the way her body braced itself whenever she prepared to move even a few inches. "You need to stay still," Mason said from the table, his tone calm, not commanding. "I'm trying," she whispered, teeth pressing lightly in her lower lip as she eased her shoulder into a better angle. Bristle crawled closer until his body rested against her hip, offering warmth. She let her hand fall onto the dog's back, her fingers sinking into his thick fur. The simple contact eased the tension in her face, and for the first time since he'd found her, Mason saw a faint glimmer of peace settle along her features. Mason sat with a whetstone and his hunting knife in front of him, sharpening the blade with a slow, deliberate rhythm. He wasn't preparing for a fight. He wasn't trying to intimidate her. He sharpened knives when his mind needed quiet, and tonight his thoughts were anything but steady. Each scrape of metal against stone helped him focus on what he could control instead of the questions he wasn't ready to ask. He watched her from the corner of his eye, not intrusively, but with the kind of attention a man gives when he's responsible for someone's life. Sonny kept glancing toward the door during every gust of wind, as if expecting it to burst open. He understood that look. He'd worn it himself for years after the raid that destroyed his world. "You're safe inside this cabin," Mason said, not lifting his gaze from the knife. She exhaled slowly. "I'm not used to walls I can trust." The statement hung between them. Mason swallowed once, a tight motion at the back of his throat, then set the knife aside. He didn't try to argue. She didn't need comfort she didn't believe in. Instead, he stood and added another log to the fire, watching the flames surge higher. The shadows on the walls shifted, making the small room feel warmer, less threatening. Mason crouched beside her, still keeping a small distance so she wouldn't feel cornered. "How bad is the pain?" Sonny looked down at her ribs. "Hurts when I breathe. Hurts worse when I move. Any sharp stabbing in the side?" "No," she said. "Just bruising. Bad bruising." "That's something," he murmured. Bruised ribs could heal. Broken ones were a different problem. She studied him as he examined her bandage, noting how he avoided sudden motions and kept his touch light. He didn't pry. He didn't stare at the torn fabric of her dress. He looked only at the wound, the swelling, the places where the cloth needed adjusting. She noticed. Her shoulders eased a little more because of it. "Long time since someone helped me without wanting something," she said quietly. Mason tightened the new bandage, his hands steady. "I'm not looking for anything." Sonny nodded, though a hesitant crease remained in her brow. "I believe you," she whispered, almost surprised at her own words. Mason finished with the bandage and stood, stretching his back with a low, tired sound. He moved to the small cupboard, pulling out a tin of beans and a piece of jerky. He cooked without speaking, stirring the pot while the smell of warmed food slowly filled the cabin. Sonny watched him, not with suspicion now, but with quiet curiosity. "You live alone?" she asked. "Yes." "How long?" "Years." She waited for more, but he didn't add anything. Mason rarely shared details unless necessary, and Sonny could tell the silence was not a dismissal, just a boundary he kept for reasons he wasn't prepared to discuss. When the beans were warm, he transferred some to a tin bowl and set it near her, within reach, but not too close to crowd her. Eat slowly. Small bites. Sani lifted the spoon with trembling fingers. The heat from the food fogged her vision for a moment, and when she tasted the first bite, her throat tightened as if her body barely remembered how to accept nourishment. Mason watched her carefully, noting how she paused after each swallow to control the discomfort in her ribs. After a few bites, she set the spoon down and leaned back. "I'll finish later." "That's fine," Mason said, taking the bowl to the table so she wouldn't feel pressured. Minutes passed quietly until the fire settled into a low, steady crackle. Sani shifted under the blanket, her voice barely above a whisper. "If those men find this place." "They won't." Mason cut in, not harshly, but with a firm certainty he rarely used for anything. He wasn't trying to reassure her with empty words. He was stating a fact he intended to uphold. She held his gaze, searching for any hesitation. There was none. "You really think they're gone?" she asked. Mason shook his head. "I think they're not close enough to worry about tonight." Her shoulders lowered a fraction, a sign of trust so small it could have been missed if Mason hadn't been watching for it. The wind hit the cabin harder, rattling the shutters with a deep thud. Sani flinched. Mason didn't look away from her. "It's only the wind," he said. "Nothing else out there right now." She slowly unclenched her fists, though her breathing remained shallow. Mason stood and walked to the door, checking the lock, the hinges, and the small wooden bar he'd added years ago after a long winter of restless nights. Everything was secure. He turned back to her, his face steady. "You can rest," he said. "I'll stay awake a while." Her eyes softened, a tired gratitude flickering through them. "Why?" "Because you shouldn't have to listen for danger tonight," he answered quietly. The stove flickered, casting warm light across the floor. Sani's eyes drifted closed, her breathing evening out as exhaustion overtook her. Bristle settled closer, guarding her with calm loyalty. And Mason sat at the table, elbows on his knees, watching the cabin's doorway with a silent promise forming behind his eyes. No one would cross that threshold without going through him first. This night marked the first time in years that two wounded souls shared the same quiet space. And neither of them slept easily, but for the first time in a long time, neither was completely alone. The morning light came in thin, pale stripes through the small window, cutting across the wooden floor and revealing dust particles drifting lazily in the quiet air. The storm had passed overnight, leaving a layer of frost outside and a chill that clung stubbornly to the cabin's walls. Mason stirred the stove back to life before the sun was fully up, stacking 2 pieces of split wood into the firebox and pushing the embers together with a poker until orange sparks jumped against the iron plate. He moved with slow, deliberate motions, careful not to make sudden noise. Sani was still asleep on the floor where he'd left her. Her breathing was deeper than the night before, no longer shaky or strained. The blanket had slipped halfway off during the night, exposing her legs to the cold. Mason crouched beside her and pulled it back up, taking care not to brush against her bruised ribs. Bristle was awake, stretched beside her with his head resting on his paws. His eyes followed Mason's every movement. The dog understood the tension that had filled the room since she arrived. He felt it in Mason's energy, in the way the cabin had gone from silent routine to guarded watchfulness in a matter of hours. Sani woke slowly. Her eyelids fluttered, her brow tightening as she tested the condition of her ribs with a deep but cautious breath. When her eyes finally opened, she needed a moment to register where she was. She stared at the ceiling first, then turned her head slightly to see Mason kneeling beside the stove. The first words she spoke were rough. "Still here." Mason glanced over his shoulder. "Yeah." The night stayed quiet. She pushed herself into a sitting position with her good arm, pausing when her ribs burned with the effort. Mason moved closer without touching. "Take it slow. The bruising will pull if you rush it." Sani nodded once, teeth clenched as she shifted enough to sit fully upright. The pain didn't break her expression, but the tightness in her jaw showed how much effort it took to remain steady. "You slept some," Mason said, returning to the stove. "Looked like you needed it." "I did," she admitted. He poured warm water from the small kettle into a tin cup, mixing in crushed herbs to dull the pain and ease her breathing. When he handed it to her, she accepted it with both hands, feeling the warmth seep into her fingers. She took a sip, then breathed out slowly. The heat relaxed her face, easing the strain in her ribs. "It helps." "Good," Mason said, sitting across from her on the floor so she wouldn't feel watched from above. "You'll need more strength before you move around again." Her eyes studied him, carefully, quietly. "You stayed awake most of the night." "Didn't sleep deep," Mason answered. "Not when someone's hurt under my roof." Sonny absorbed that, a flicker of something unreadable moving through her expression. Gratitude, maybe, or simply the relief of not being forced out the door the moment morning came. Mason stood, grabbed a small tin bowl, and filled it with warm beans from the pot he'd left simmering. He set it near her feet, but didn't push it closer. "Eat when you're ready." She lifted the spoon with her good hand, taking slow, small bites. Mason sat at the table and watched the fire instead of watching her eat. He didn't want her to feel pressured or observed like prey. The quiet stretched comfortably between them. No tension, no fear, just the sound of her spoon scraping lightly against the tin bowl. After she finished half the portion, Sonny pushed the bowl aside and wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "My head's clearer today." Mason nodded. "You'll get better faster now that you're warm and fed." She hesitated. Her gaze dropped to the blanket before she spoke again. "I didn't expect kindness from anyone out here." Mason leaned back in his chair, folding his arms loosely across his chest. "I don't offer it often." "Why me?" she asked. He considered that, his eyes drifting to the frost-covered window. "Because you were dying in my woods. Because Bristle wouldn't leave you. Because walking away would have sat wrong with me for the rest of my life." Sonny pressed her lips together in a faint, thoughtful line. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. Her face showed it clearly enough. After a long moment, she shifted the blanket again. "I should tell you why I was out there." Mason didn't move. "Only if you want to." "I need you to know," she said firmly, though her voice stayed soft. He nodded once. "Then tell me when you're ready." She looked toward the fire, gathering whatever piece of courage she had left. "Men followed me for 3 days. I escaped them at the river crossing and ran into the hills. I thought I could lose them in the rocks. But I fell. I hit my ribs. After that, I could only walk small distances at a time." Mason's jaw tightened. "They wanted you dead?" Her eyes flickered with something darker than fear. "Not dead." He understood immediately and felt a coldness in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Before he could answer, she added, "I don't know if they're still searching." "They won't reach this cabin," Mason said evenly. "You sound sure." "I am." She studied him again, searching his expression for cracks. She found none. Mason wasn't a man who offered false comfort. His confidence came from experience, not wishful thinking. He stood, grabbed his coat, and walked toward the door. "I'm checking the trap line. Brist'll stay with you." Sonny watched him pull the door open, letting in a burst of cold air before he stepped outside. He didn't look back, but he didn't need to. He already thought of her safety as his responsibility. When the door shut behind him, Sonny exhaled slowly. The warmth of the cabin pressed around her, gentle and steady. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, she felt anchored to a place where danger wasn't breathing down her neck. She wrapped the blanket tighter, listening to the fire crackle. This morning, for reasons she didn't want to analyze too deeply yet, she felt a small spark she hadn't carried in a long time. The belief that she might survive another day. The sun climbed slowly across the pale winter sky, casting a thin brightness over the trees behind Mason's cabin. By midday, the frost had begun to soften into patches of damp soil, leaving the ground slick beneath the boots Mason wore as he returned from checking his trapline. His shoulders carried the cold, and faint steam rose from his breath as he reached the porch. The moment he opened the door, warm air brushed against his face, along with the familiar creak of the hinges he kept meaning to fix. Inside, Sonny sat propped near the stove with a blanket wrapped around her legs. She wasn't lying down anymore, an improvement that didn't escape Mason's attention the second he stepped inside. Bristles sat beside her, chin resting on his paws, as if he'd been guarding her the entire time. The dog lifted his head when Mason entered but didn't move far, as though he had decided his new duty was to stay close to the wounded woman. Sonny looked up at Mason with a clarity that hadn't been there the night before. Her breathing still carried a faint roughness, but her eyes were alert and steady. "You were gone long," she said softly, adjusting the blanket to ease pressure on her ribs. "Covered more ground than usual," Mason replied, hanging his coat near the door. "Wanted to see if there were fresh tracks along the ridge." Her fingers tightened slightly around the blanket. The reaction was small, but Mason caught it. Fear didn't surface loudly with people who had survived too much. It showed itself in small, controlled movements. "Anything out there?" she asked. "No sign of strangers," he answered. "Snow-covered old prints. Haven't seen new ones." Sonny exhaled slowly, and for the first time, the tension in her shoulders loosened completely. Mason moved to the wash basin, wiping the dirt from his hands. "Your ribs?" he asked, not turning fully toward her. "Still sore," she admitted. "Not as sharp as yesterday." He nodded, drying his hands on a cloth. "That's a good start." For a few long seconds, the room settled into quiet. The fire cracked inside the stove, and the smell of burning pine drifted across the cabin. Sonny watched Mason with a thoughtful expression, one shaped by days of fear, exhaustion, and the need to measure every person she met. "You said last night you'd tell me more when you were ready," Mason said, pulling a chair closer but sitting at a respectful distance. "If you want to talk now, I'm listening." Sonny didn't look away. She didn't shrink back. Instead, she straightened her back with slow determination, her body protesting the movement but not stopping her. "I'll tell you everything," she said, "because if those men come here, you should know what they're capable of." Mason leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. He didn't push, didn't interrupt. His face remained calm, but his jaw tightened with a subtle flare when she mentioned the men again. Sonny pulled the blanket closer. The warmth from the stove illuminated the outline of her cheekbones and the fading bruises along her shoulder. "A month ago," she began, "I lived near the foothills north of the reservation. My husband's family had a small winter camp. Quiet, nothing there worth stealing." Her voice grew steadier with each sentence. "But men came anyway. They weren't soldiers. They weren't settlers. Just men with guns and an appetite for violence." Mason's eyes narrowed slightly, though he kept his posture relaxed. "How many?" "For when they arrived. More joined them later." She paused, jaw locking as if she had to force herself to continue. "They killed my husband when he tried to keep them from our belongings. Shot him in front of me. Then they searched the camp, took what they wanted, burned the rest." Mason's breath tightened in his chest. He didn't move or speak, but a cold anger settled behind his eyes, the kind of anger that didn't shout but built slowly like pressure under stone. "When they turned to me," Sonny continued, "I ran. I didn't stop, not even to look back." Her hand trembled for a second before she steadied it against her leg. "They tracked me for days. They weren't trying to kill me. They wanted to take me alive." Mason lowered his gaze to the floorboards for just a moment, restraining the instinctive fury rising through him. When he lifted his eyes again, they carried a firm, controlled resolve. "You said you lost them near the river," he said quietly. "Ow!" A flash flood cut across the valley. "I crossed before the water rose." "They didn't." Her voice remained calm. "I kept walking until my legs failed me. That's when I fell in the rocks. My ribs, they cracked, I think." Mason nodded slowly, absorbing every detail. He didn't question her story. He didn't demand proof. Everything he needed to know was written clearly across her injuries and the exhaustion she carried. "Those men won't reach this far without leaving signs," he said. "And I didn't see a single fresh track today." Sonny studied him. "Why are you helping me?" "Men like you, they avoid trouble that isn't theirs." Mason's expression softened, though his voice stayed firm. "I've seen what happens when people turn their backs. I won't be part of that." Her lips parted slightly, a quiet recognition passing through her eyes. Not gratitude exactly. Something deeper, something shaped by disbelief turning into acceptance. Your life will get harder if they come, she warned. Then I'll handle it, he said simply. I've done harder things. She breathed in carefully, ribs protesting, but not enough to stop her. You don't owe me anything. Mason stood, walking to the stove to adjust the fire. Maybe not, but you're here. And until you decide where you're going next, you don't face anything alone. The room grew still again, but this stillness felt different, warmer, grounded, shaped by two people who understood danger and loss without needing to explain every detail. Sonny's voice broke the silence. Then I'll stay until I can walk far again. Mason nodded once, a subtle shift in his shoulders showing silent acceptance of her choice. Bristle leaned into her side, his tail thumping once. And in that small, quiet cabin, the first threads of trust tightened between them. Fragile, new, but strong enough to change everything that came next. The next morning began with a break in the cold that felt almost unnatural after so many days of biting wind. The air held a faint warmth, just enough for the frost to loosen its grip on the ground outside. Sunlight reached into the cabin through the narrow window, striking the wall in a soft, uneven band. Mason noticed the shift immediately. Weather like this gave him a few hours to repair things around the property before the cold returned. Sonny had slept sitting up against the wall near the stove, her blanket wrapped tightly around her waist and chest. Her ribs still ached, but she no longer winced each time she breathed. When Mason stepped from the bedroom space in the main room, she lifted her head slowly, blinking away the stiffness in her neck. You rested, Mason said, pulling on his boots. Better than yesterday, she replied, adjusting the blanket so it didn't press against her bandaged shoulder. He nodded, satisfied, then grabbed the kettle to warm water for both of them. The stove crackled quietly as he added a piece of wood. Sonny watched him move, measured, cautious, avoiding anything that might startle her. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, but not the kind meant to intimidate. It was the kind that came from years spent depending on nobody but himself. A small silence settled between them until Sonny spoke again. I want to stand today. Mason looked over, eyebrow raised. If you try too much too soon, you'll slow your healing. I know my limits, she said gently, and I know when I can push past them. He didn't argue. She'd survived days of pursuit with broken ribs. She wasn't the type to exaggerate her strength. He set 2 cups on the table and poured warm water into both. Start with a few steps, not more. Sonny lifted herself with her good arm, grimacing when her ribs tightened. Mason moved closer without touching, ready to help if her legs faltered, but staying far enough that she didn't feel cornered. She pulled herself upright, using the edge of the stove for balance. Bristle got up immediately, tail wagging slowly as he positioned himself beside her leg, as if offering another point of support. Sonny smiled faintly at the dog. He worries. He has good judgment, Mason replied. She stood breathing carefully through the pain, waiting until her legs steadied. Then, with slow steps, she began to move across the cabin. The floorboards creaked under her feet. Her gaze stayed focused forward, determined not to show weakness. Mason walked behind her at a distance, watching every shift in her posture. When she reached the wall opposite the stove, she rested her palm against it and exhaled in relief. Sweat gathered at her temple, and her ribs burned, but she stayed upright. That's enough, Mason said. I'm not finished, she answered through clenched teeth. He didn't push back. She took 2 more steps, then finally returned to the blanket by the stove before her legs gave out. Mason crouched beside her. You're pushing too hard. I need to move, she insisted. My body turns weaker if I sit still too long. He considered that, then nodded. We'll do more later, in smaller pieces. Sonny leaned back against the wall, breathing slowly to calm the sharp pain in her ribs. She watched Mason as he prepared a simple meal, beans, dried venison soaked to soften, and a piece of bread he sliced into smaller chunks. His motions were deliberate, each task done with a focus that suggested he'd spent years surviving on routine. While he worked, she spoke quietly. You're comfortable in silence. I learned to be, Mason said without looking up. Talking doesn't change much out here. It tells something about the person, she said. Mason set her portion near the blanket. What does it tell about me? That you've spent most of your life carrying things alone, she answered. He paused, the knife resting against the wooden table, but he didn't respond. He simply placed the tool aside and sat across from her, pulling his own portion of food closer. Sonny took a bite, chewing slowly. When did your wife pass? She asked, her tone respectful, not invasive. Mason stiffened, but didn't pull away. She had offered her story. He realized he owed her enough truth not to deflect. 6 years ago, he said, raid hit the homestead. I was working a mile away. Came back too late. Sonny lowered her eyes. I'm sorry. He nodded once, the memory still a heavy weight, but not as sharp as it used to be. Since then, this land has been all I've had. Does it feel empty? Sometimes, he admitted. Sonny absorbed his words quietly. She didn't follow them with sympathy or hollow comfort. She let them stand as facts, the same way she wanted her truths to be heard without pity. After they finished eating, Mason stepped outside to bring him more firewood. The cold hit him immediately, but the sunlight warmed the tops of his shoulders as he crossed the clearing. When he returned, he found Sonny sitting straighter than before, watching him intently. You looked out there like you expected trouble, she said. I always look for trouble, Mason answered. Doesn't hurt to stay ahead of it. She nodded. Men who hunt others rarely stop because of weather. Mason held her gaze. If they come here, they'll find they made a mistake. Sonny studied the firmness in his eyes, seeing something unspoken, something shaped by loss, survival, and a refusal to lose anyone else under his watch. You don't even know me, she whispered. I know enough, Mason replied. You ran until your body broke. You fought to stay alive. That's more than most people ever do. You're worth protecting. The words hit her harder than she expected. For a moment, the bruises didn't matter. The cracked ribs didn't matter. Only the rare sincerity in Mason's voice. Sonny blinked slowly, absorbing that without letting emotion show too clearly. Then I'll do my part, she said. I'll get stronger. I won't be a burden. You're not, Mason said plainly. You're a guest, not an obligation, not a problem, not something to hide. A guest. Her breath trembled with something she couldn't name. Respect, relief, maybe the early stirrings of trust. Sonny lay back carefully, letting her ribs settle into a comfortable position. Mason fed the stove another log, the sparks rising behind the iron grate. Outside, the wind slowed. Inside, the distance between them changed, quietly, without being spoken. Both of them felt it. Neither of them said it. By the time the next morning arrived, the weather had shifted again. The sun hovered low but bright, melting thin streaks of frost that clung to the wooden railing outside the cabin. The sky carried a pale, washed-out blue, the kind that made every sound travel farther across the open land. Mason stepped onto the porch with a slow breath, rubbing the stiffness from his shoulders as he scanned the tree line out of habit. The silence around the property felt natural today. No distant shouts, no crunch of unfamiliar footsteps, no signs of trespass. It eased something tight in his chest. Inside, Sonny pushed herself upright, bracing her good arm against the floor before gathering the blanket around her. Her ribs still protested, but she could shift without the stabbing pain that had controlled every movement earlier. Bristle lifted his head and wagged his tail once, sensing her intent before she even stood. Sonny steadied herself against the wall as she rose. Her legs trembled from disuse, but the determination in her eyes was stronger than the weakness in her muscles. She had spent days fleeing, crawling, surviving. Yet somehow, stepping outside Mason's door brought a new kind of hesitation. It wasn't fear of the woods or the land. It was the unfamiliar feeling of walking into a place she wasn't running away from. Mason turned when he heard the soft creak of the floorboards. You're up earlier than I expected. I want to see the day, she said, pulling the blanket tighter. I want to breathe outside again. Mason didn't question her. He didn't warn her about the cold or insist she sit back down. He only stepped aside, letting her choose her own pace. Stay close to the doorway until you find your balance. She nodded and took one careful step forward, then another. Each shift of her weight felt like learning to walk again, slow, tense, deliberate. Bristle pressed himself against her shin, guiding her like a steadying post. Sonny touched his head gently, letting the contact help her stay upright. When she reached the open doorway, she paused, breathing in the clean morning air. The cold brushed her cheeks, sharper than the heat from the stove, but somehow more welcome. She looked out at the stretch of land, faded grass, patches of thawing snow, the distant slope of the hillside, and her shoulders lowered in a way Mason had not seen before. It was a slow release of tension, like a weight sliding down her spine. "It's quiet," she whispered. "Quieter than most places," Mason replied, stepping beside her. Sonny's eyes scanned the horizon with caution, not distrust. "You've lived here long? Long enough to learn every sound it makes," he said. "Long enough to feel when something's wrong." "And you feel nothing wrong today?" she asked. Mason shook his head. "Nothing at all." She breathed deeper, letting that answer settle into her bones. "Good." After a moment, she shuffled forward, her bare feet brushing the edge of the porch. Mason stayed within reach, but didn't touch her. He wanted her to move on her own terms. She placed both hands on the wooden railing, steadying herself, and gazed at the yard as if it were a foreign world she had been away from for too long. The wind shifted, rustling her hair and lifting the loose strands that had fallen from her braid. The beads woven into it clicked softly, the sound delicate against the harshness of the land. "You could stay out here longer if you sit," Mason suggested, nodding toward the top step. Sonny lowered herself slowly, using the railing for support. When she sat, she felt the cold wood through the blanket, but didn't mind. The open air brought something she had missed since her escape: space. The kind that didn't close in around you or trap your breath in fear. Mason sat on the step below her, one leg stretched out, the other bent. He rested his forearm on his knee as he looked out across the property. "Your land is wide," Sonny said, studying the distant fields. "It keeps me busy. Does it keep you company?" Mason hesitated. "Some days." Sonny didn't push further. She lifted her face toward the sunlight, letting it warm the bruises across her cheekbone. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply exist without running, without glancing over her shoulder, without calculating escape routes. Mason watched her quietly, noticing the small changes, the way her breath steadied, the way her shoulders no longer pressed so tightly together, the way her gaze softened when she looked at the horizon instead of the floor. "You're getting stronger," he said. "I feel it," she replied. "Not enough yet, but more than before. You'll be able to walk the yard soon." "I hope so." "You will," he said. That simple certainty made her swallow hard, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief forming behind her expression. She wrapped the blanket tighter, grounding herself. After a long pause, she turned to Mason. "When I heal enough, what do you want me to do?" He looked at her with a slow inhale. "Nothing. Recover. Rest. Stay safe." She studied him closely. Most men would ask something. "I'm not most men." "No," she said quietly. "You're not." Bristle climbed up beside her, leaning his full weight against her hip as if claiming her as part of the household. She stroked his head gently. "He trusts you," Mason said. "Dogs know things faster than people," she replied. Mason nodded. "He knew you weren't a threat the moment he found you." "And you?" she asked softly. "When did you know?" He thought for a moment. "When you asked for help instead of hiding." Sonny turned her face toward the yard again, her expression unreadable but no longer shut down. She stayed on the porch until her ribs began to ache. Mason walked behind her slowly as she re-entered the cabin, making sure she didn't lose her footing. When she sank onto the blanket near the stove, her breaths were shallow but strong, painful, yet stable. "You did well today," Mason said. "It felt like the first real morning I've seen in days," she replied. Mason added wood to the fire, the glow brightening the room. Inside that small cabin, a subtle shift had begun. Sonny no longer felt like someone passing through danger. She was becoming part of the place. And Mason no longer felt like a man living alone in silence. Neither spoke of it, but both felt it. By late afternoon, a gentle haze settled over the property, softening the hard edges of the land. The light wasn't warm, but it wasn't harsh anymore either. It carried a calmness Mason had not felt in years. He stood beside the chopping block near the barn, splitting wood with long, steady swings. Each strike echoed across the open space in a slow, dependable rhythm. His breath fogged out in short bursts while the cold clung to his clothes, but his movements stayed controlled and deliberate. From the porch, Sonny watched him with quiet focus. She sat wrapped in a thicker blanket Mason had brought from the storage chest, her posture straighter than the morning, her eyes sharper, clearer. Her ribs still hurt, but she could now draw breath without flinching. Bristles stayed at her feet, occasionally lifting his head to follow Mason's movements. Sonny didn't speak. She simply observed the man who had taken her in, a man who never raised his voice, never questioned her presence, never asked anything from her except that she heal. She noticed things she hadn't before. The way his shoulders rolled before each swing, the slight hitch in his breath when he paused to adjust his grip, the faint scar that cut across his forearm from some old injury he never mentioned. Mason finished stacking the cut logs and turned toward the porch. He caught her watching, but didn't comment. Instead, he brushed the wood dust from his coat and walked up the steps, his boots leaving small tracks in the thin layer of thawing frost. "You shouldn't be sitting out here too long," he said, though his tone held no reprimand. "Cold sinks into the bones faster when you're still healing." "I like the air," she replied softly. "Inside gets heavy after a while." He understood that better than most. "Come in when your ribs start aching." "They already do," she admitted, rising carefully. Mason stepped back to allow her space to move. She followed him inside slowly, gripping the doorframe to steady herself. Once she lowered in her usual spot near the stove, the familiar warmth spread across her aching body. She let out a shallow breath, letting the heat settle around her ribs. Mason poured warm water into a tin cup and handed it to her. She took it with both hands, feeling the comfort of the heat against her palms. "Thank you." He sat across from her, elbows resting on his knees. "You'll be walking farther soon." "Not yet," she said with a faint smile. "But soon." As she sipped the water, Mason worked on repairing a broken strap from one of his saddlebags. He pulled a needle and thread from a small box on the table and threaded the needle with practiced efficiency. Sonny watched his fingers, steady and strong, guiding the leather together with precise stitches. "You do things carefully," she observed. "Being careless cost me too much," he replied. She held his gaze for a moment before looking back at the fire. There was no judgment in his voice, only truth carried by a man who had lived with consequences for too long. After a few minutes, Sonny shifted the blanket and adjusted her injured arm. "When I was traveling alone," she said, her voice low but steady, "I kept moving because stopping meant death. The nights were the worst. The darkness felt alive, waiting." Mason listened without interrupting. He didn't fidget or look away. He simply gave her space to speak. "I slept in caves, under fallen branches, wherever I could hide. But I never really slept. My ears stayed open. My breath stayed tight." She traced the edge of the blanket with her fingertips. "This is the first place where I wasn't afraid to close my eyes." Mason swallowed once. The admission hit deeper than she intended, stirring something inside him he rarely allowed to surface. "I'm glad you feel safe here," he said quietly. Sonny looked around the cabin. The worn shelves, the iron stove, the tools neatly arranged, the faint scratches on the floor from Bristle's old puppy days. "It feels lived in, not empty." Mason hesitated, then answered truthfully. "It was empty for years." Sonny nodded slowly, understanding far more than he said aloud. Bristle patted closer and nudged her hand until she stroked his head. Mason watched the interaction with a faint warmth in his expression, a subtle shift that softened the edges of his normally guarded demeanor. "You should eat," Mason said gently, rising from his chair. "I can help," Sonny replied, trying to push herself up. Mason raised a hand slightly, not ordering, just offering clarity. "Your ribs will tear if you twist wrong. Let me handle it." She sank back down reluctantly. I just don't want to sit while you work. You're not sitting, he said, turning to the stove. You're healing. That counts. Sani lowered her gaze to the floor, both humbled and unsettled by the kindness. It had been so long since anyone insisted she rest for her own sake. Mason ladled warm stew into 2 bowls, steam rising into the air with a calming scent. He set her portion in front of her before lowering himself to the floor on the opposite side of the small table. Sani ate slowly, savoring each bite. Her stomach did not like before. Instead, the food settled gently, warming her from the inside. When they finished, Mason leaned back against the wall, watching the fire throw shifting patterns across the room. Sani tucked her knees beneath the blanket, resting her cheek against the wood behind her. For the first time since arriving, she felt herself growing comfortable simply being in the same room as another person. Mason broke the silence first. Once your ribs heal, you can stay as long as you choose. Or leave if that's what you want. Sani didn't look at him immediately. When she finally did, her eyes were steady. Leaving isn't my first thought anymore. The admission settled over the room like a quiet confirmation of something building steadily, piece by piece, in every silent moment between them. Mason didn't smile, but something softened in his posture. Sani noticed. Outside, the wind had stopped completely. Inside, the cabin felt full for the first time in years. The last days of winter loosened their hold on the land. The snow that had clung stubbornly to the hills melted into thin, silver patches that glistened under the morning sun. A faint breeze carried the smell of damp soil instead of frozen air, and the distant groan of shifting branches signaled the slow arrival of spring. Mason stood outside near the fence line, tightening a length of new wire while Bristle lay beside him, head lifted, watching every movement. Sani stepped out of the cabin without calling for him. She no longer clutched the doorway for balance, no longer winced with each shift of breath. Her ribs were still tender, but she could walk with confidence now, each step a quiet confirmation of how far she had come. The blanket had been replaced with one of Mason's old coats, which hung loosely around her shoulders but gave her enough warmth to move freely. Mason noticed her and straightened. Didn't expect you up so early. I couldn't stay inside, she replied, walking toward him at a slow, steady pace. The air feels new today. He set the wire down and leaned his hands on the fence, studying her carefully. Your steps look strong. They feel strong, she said. Stronger than I thought they would this soon. Her gaze drifted over the land, across the uneven fields, the barn leaning slightly to one side, the quiet hills beyond the trees. The place looked different now. Not because the land had changed, but because she had allowed herself to see it without the filter of fear. Mason followed her gaze. When you first arrived, I didn't know if you'd make it through the night. Sani turned toward him, her voice steady. I didn't know either. They stood in silence for a moment, the wind brushing lightly against their clothes. Bristle rose and trotted between them, nudging Sani's knee as if reminding her that she belonged here more than she realized. Sani reached down and scratched behind the dog's ear. He's why I'm alive, she said. He's stubborn, Mason replied. He wouldn't leave your side, even when I tried to carry you home. Sani lifted her eyes to Mason's. But you carried me anyway. Mason didn't answer at first. He looked down at the dirt, his boots scuffed from years of work, his breath slow and controlled. When he finally spoke, his voice held something different, something unhidden. I carried you because it felt wrong to walk away. I've walked away from things I can't change, but not from people who still have a chance. Her expression softened. She stepped closer, just enough to stand within arm's reach, though she kept her posture open and calm. You didn't have to take me in. You didn't have to keep me safe. I know, Mason said softly, but I wanted to. The openness in his tone settled warm and heavy in her chest. Not pressure, comfort. Sani shifted her weight, running her fingers along the top rail of the fence. I've been thinking, she said, about where I go next, about what life looks like after the fear fades. Mason's jaw tightened subtly, the faintest sign that her answer mattered more to him than he intended to show. You want to return north? No, she said immediately. There's nothing left for me there. Then what do you want? He asked, voice steady but quiet. Sonny stepped closer, the coat brushing lightly against his sleeve. Her eyes didn't waver. I want a place I don't have to run from. Somewhere I can breathe. Somewhere I can build something new. Mason's shoulders lowered. You can stay here, he said, no hesitation in the words. For as long as you want. She nodded once, a slow, meaningful movement. I choose here. The air between them shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Mason felt a tightening in his chest, not from tension, but from a warmth he hadn't felt in years. He lifted his hand slightly, giving her room to step away if she wished. Instead, Sonny rested her hand on his forearm, the gesture light but certain. Mason, she said, her voice steady. I didn't survive to walk back into loneliness. He met her gaze fully, the guardedness in his eyes finally easing. You won't be alone here. A long silence followed, not empty, but full of quiet understanding. Bristle circled them once, then sat at their feet as if sealing the moment himself. Sonny smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried endurance behind it rather than ease. Then let this be my home. Mason exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest loosening in a way he hadn't expected. It will be, he said. If you want it to be more than that, it can be. Sonny stepped close enough for their shoulders to touch. I want to stay beside the man who carried me out of death's reach, she whispered. Not because I owe him anything, but because I trust him. Mason's voice softened. Then stay beside me. Not as a guest. Sonny's eyes warmed. As your wife. Mason nodded, every muscle in his body steady. If that's what you want. I do, she said. He didn't pull her into an embrace. Not yet. He placed his hand over hers, resting gently, firmly, with the full weight of a promise behind it. Bristle barked once, short and bright, as if announcing the decision to the land. Sonny laughed softly, the sound filling the cold morning with unexpected warmth. And just like that, the lonely cabin on the edge of Horseshoe Bend no longer belonged to a man surviving his past. It belonged to a man and woman building a future. A home no longer empty. A life no longer running. A love born from staying. Their story closed with clarity, certainty, and peace. Two wounded souls choosing each other, not out of desperation, but out of trust.